Welcome to Biblical Psychology, the channel that combines psychological ideas with scripture to help you respond more effectively to the promises in the Bible with regards to mental health. And if this is the first time that you're tuning in, please do have a look at some of our previous episodes, particularly the first one, which talks about the vision behind the channel. So today we're going to take a look at coping with death and loss, or in other words, bereavement. And I'm going to talk about some psychological ideas which help us to understand our natural grief process, and look at some factors which either prevent us or block us recovering spontaneously from grief. And finally, we're going to take a look at how Jesus addressed death and dying. Now, everyone has to cope with bereavement at some stage of their life. And death can be seen as the final stage of development. And in fact, the Bible has a lot to say about our appointed time of dying. And some examples include Ecclesiastes 3 verse 2, which states, "A time to be born and a time to die." Hebrews 9 verse 27 states, "And as it is appointed unto men once to die, and after this the judgment." So we all know that death and dying is part of life and our existence here on earth. But it doesn't make it any easier for us when the time comes for us to have to cope with the loss of a loved one. And Warden, a famous person by the name of Warden, in 1991, developed what's called the tier model, which highlights the stages that one may go through when experiencing natural grief. And in this model, it suggested that there are certain tasks of grief. So it talks about 4 tasks in grief. T refers to accept the reality of the loss. E is experience the pain of the loss. And A is adjustment to the new environment without the lost person. And R is reinvest in the new reality. So this tier model suggests that this is a natural stage of recovery from grief. However, in some instances, individuals might not experience spontaneous recovery from grief, and there can be some complications that could occur. And research suggests that there are certain factors that can make one experience a complicated or a complex grief reaction. And one relates to the unexpectedness of the loss, or in other words, someone having a premature death. And we'll talk some more about that when we look at some scriptures, and we'll see how Jesus dealt with people who had suffered premature death. Another factor is the absence of social support. Now, someone who adopts a biblical worldview, it's quite normal for them to belong to a church, and this might not be too much of a problem for them, because it's likely that they would receive social support from other church members. And another factor is concurrent loss or illness. So having to cope with other losses and illness, as well as losing a loved one, can also create complications in our natural grief process. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to now look at the Bible and see how Jesus dealt with individuals who may have suffered premature death. So the first example is taken from John 11, verses 20 through to 45. Now, it's quite a long passage, so I haven't extracted everything from the Bible, but just to give you some context, this is a situation where one of Jesus's friends by the name of Lazarus became unwell, and Jesus was in a different town to the one that he was in at the time. But his sisters got word to Jesus to let him know that he was unwell, very unwell in fact. And I believe that his sisters were expecting that Jesus would perform a miracle and restore Lazarus back to health. But it was 4 days, in fact, that had passed before Jesus was able to get into the town where Lazarus was. And in the meantime, Lazarus had died. So I'm going to start the story at the point where Jesus meets his sister Martha. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him. But Mary sat still in the house. Then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if thou had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know even now, whatsoever you will ask of God, God will give it to you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection of the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God, who should come into the world. Then when Mary was come where Jesus was, she saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying unto him, If thou had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came to her, he groaned in the spirit, and was troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Jesus, again groaning in himself, went to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Jesus said, Take away the stone, Martha. The sister of him that was dead said to him, Lord, by this time he stinks, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Said I not to you, if you would believe, you will see the glory of God? Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and I know that you hear me always, but because of the people which stand by, I said it, that they might believe that you have sent me. And when he had spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. Jesus said to them, Loose him and let him go. Then many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did believed on him. So we see from that passage that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. But before he did this, he checked with both of his sisters whether they believed that this could happen. And fortunately they did. And I believe that it's their faith combined with the act of compassion that Jesus had that enabled Lazarus to be raised from the dead. And now we're going to take a look at another example of where Jesus raised someone from the dead. And this is taken from Luke 7:11 to 15. And it came to pass the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and much people. Now when he came near to the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much people of the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said unto her, Weep not. And he came and touched the bier, and they that stood still. And he said, Young man, I say to you, arise. And he that was dead began to speak, and he delivered him to his mother. And there came upon all the people, and they glorified God, saying that a great prophet is risen up amongst us, and that God has visited his people. So there we see another example of where Jesus rose a young lad from the dead. And to some of you hearing this, it might sound, very far-fetched. But Jesus did say that these works that I do, you will do also, and greater works than these will you do. So resurrection from the dead is definitely a gift that the Lord has left for his church. And I personally, I've known of people who have been raised from the dead, and I even share my own testimony where I had died actually from COVID when I was in hospital during the pandemic, and my family and my church prayed intensively for my recovery, and I'm here today to tell the story. So I leave those thoughts with you, and hopefully you may have received something that may assist you with your recovery of grief. And don't forget to subscribe, because that way you'll be kept informed of all the other episodes coming up. Bye-bye.